All right, we're about ready to get started. Let me go ahead and pull up my chat. Make sure everything's working here, and then we'll go ahead and get going. I'll give a few minutes for folks to get joined in, and then we'll start working our way through 40 years of West Point classes. How's everybody doing? So as I just typed in the chat and I pinned the comment, anytime we do these streams that are specific to a topic, I ask that you please keep the discussion and the questions to the topic so we can talk about the people. We can talk about West Point. We can talk about anything related to what we're talking about here. If we get through this fairly fast and we've got some time at the end, I may just open it up to a general Q&A, or we can just chat about whatever. But at least to start, I want to keep the topic on West Point and on the people we're talking about. So basically what I'm going to do with this is a West Point class of 2012. Awesome, Will. Very cool. Welcome. One of our moderators on our Discord server is... I think now starting his second year at West Point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work my way. I've got a list here in Google Docs of each of the West Point classes from 1822 through 1862. Now, there were a few West Point grads prior to 1822 who had minor roles in the Civil War, but none of the prominent people that we're going to be talking about today. So what I'm going to do is I've got a list of each of the West Point classes, how many were in that class, and some of the most prominent Civil War officers to come out of that class and what their class rank was. So, for example, you got Joseph Mansfield was second in the class of 1822. Isaac Trimble was 17th in that class, etc. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of narrow these down to who I think was the best officer out of each class based on how they did in the American Civil War, regardless of what rank they were. And I'll ask you guys for your feedback and all of that too, because some of these I probably will not have a clear winner in my own mind. And some of these is going to be interesting. You're going to see, it's fascinating to see who graduated with who. You know, for example, not a lot of people realize that, for example, Robert E. Lee and Joseph Johnston were in the same West Point class. So were George McClellan and Stonewall Jackson, for example. So the answer is McClellan for every choice. Lucky Diamond, I have not, but as I asked already, we're not going to be talking about things outside of this topic today. So welcome, everybody. And we're going to go ahead and get started. So the class of 1822. So these are guys that would have been in their 60s during the American Civil War. So they're still kind of on the older end. Most of the folks that you're going to recognize their names are going to come in like the classes of the 1840s and 1850s. But some of these guys have a role to play here. So just a couple of names stand out to me right off the bat. Isaac Trimble commanded a division at Gettysburg. Joseph Mansfield was a corps commander who was killed at the Battle of Antietam, commanding one of the Union Corps. Trimble's a Confederate general. So David Hunter is a division commander right at the beginning of the war, but doesn't really rise too far above that. George McCall, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, was a sergeant in the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry, actually served on George McCall's staff during the Peninsula Campaign. So kind of a cool personal connection I have to that one. But right off the bat, I'm going to eliminate a few of these. Abercrombie, no. George Wright, no. Honestly, for me, this one really comes down to Mansfield and Trimble. Now, Trimble, kind of an interesting story. He's the guy who, if you're familiar with the Battle of Gettysburg, very... yeah, you're right. David Hunter was a big advocate of black troops. Lots of Confederate officers graduated from West Point. We're looking at one right now, Isaac Trimble. Perfect example of a Confederate officer from West Point. Trimble was without a command during the Gettysburg campaign. He was a major general, but there was no spot for him to command a division in the Confederate Army at that time. He had come back, and so they basically kind of had him there as kind of an extra officer until they needed one. And he's the one who goes to General Lee the night of July 1st into July 2nd, just livid over the fact that General Ewell did not take the hills beyond the town of Gettysburg. And there's that very famous scene in the movie where he says, and whether it happened or not, it's in the book, Killer Angels, but he goes to General Lee and he tells him, I told, General Ewell, give me one division and I'll take that hill. And Ewell said nothing. He says, give me one brigade and I will take that hill. And he said nothing. And he says, finally, he was getting irritated and he said, General Ewell, give me one regiment and I will take that hill. And he said, Ewell just said nothing. He just stood there. So it's between those two for me. Joseph Mansfield's hard to say what he might have done because he was killed early in the war. Trimble does end up commanding a division at Gettysburg. He leads one of the divisions in Pickett's charge. Because I think, trying to remember whose division he commanded. Was it Dorsey Pender's division? But now, moments in trading, it's a little tricky when you say General Lee was head of West Point. There were two different offices at West Point. One was like Commandant of West Point, and one was like the head of cadets or something like that. Lee was not actually in charge of West Point. I think he was like Commandant of Cadets or something. He was superintendent of the military academy, but he was not the commandant. Those were two different positions. I'm not entirely sure of the difference, but I don't think Lee was actually in charge at West Point. Yeah, it was Pender's division, Ryan. Thank you. That's what I thought. Trimble, I don't think Trimble was, if he was injured, it wasn't badly in Pickett's charge, but he may have been, yeah. I think I have to go with Mansfield here for this one. All right, so class of 1823 is a little easier for me. I think it's got to be George Greene. Again, one of the oldest officers at the Battle of Gettysburg for the Union. Let's talk about Lorenzo Thomas for a minute because he's a lesser known character from the Union Army. And you can see there, he's kind of an old-looking dude. He was the adjutant general of the U.S. Army, basically for the entire Civil War. He's 70 years old in 1875. But just before the start of the war, he's promoted to colonel and adjutant general of the U.S. Army. So he really did not have a field command. And so, honestly, Nathaniel, that makes sense to me. One's in charge of military training, the other one's in charge of academics. So for me, I mean, it's not much of a choice here because really George Sears Greene's the only one who's a actual field commander, and he was a pretty solid general for the Union during the Civil War. Graduated second in the class of 1823. So pretty good. Minimum carrot, thank you, I appreciate that. Trimble was shot in the left leg and left on the field. I knew he was captured during Pickett's charge, but I could not remember for sure if he was wounded. He had his leg amputated, okay. Superintendent is overall. Dean is academic. The commandant is in charge of military. Okay. All right. So now we get into a little bit more here. Class of 1825. We've got Daniel Donaldson, who died during the Civil War, and he's the one that Fort Donelson is named after. Didn't have a prominent role. I think he died of like dysentery or something. Benjamin Huger. I mean, it's weird. It's not pronounced Huger the way it looks. Confederate general as well. Robert Anderson, who is in command of Fort Sumter when the war begins, ends up a general but doesn't do a whole lot. Charles F. Smith, another really interesting character, and we'll talk a little bit about him here in a minute. I'm going to eliminate a few right off the bat. Montgomery, no. Donelson didn't do much. Same here. I think it's really going to come down to these two, but honestly, for me, the clear choice here is Charles Ferguson Smith. Josh Davis, how's it going? So C.F. Smith was actually, and again, not remembering the difference between the two, he was either superintendent of West Point or commandant, one of those two positions, when Ulysses S. Grant was at West Point in the 1840s, and then ends up serving under Grant during the early stages of the Civil War. I am not prior military, but I have incredible respect for all those who are. Tasmanian Walrus, when I saw the name Lorenzo Thomas, the first thing I thought of was the raising of colored troops. I thought that was him that I was thinking of during the Vicksburg campaign that helped organize some of those early regiments that fought. But C.F. Smith was a solid general, and he unfortunately dies right around the time of Shiloh. But served under Grant, and it was uncomfortable for Grant because this is a guy who had been his boss at West Point. And now he found himself serving over C.F. Smith. And there were some moves early on in 1862 to try and, in fact, I think at one point Grant was kind of bypassed for C.F. Smith in what eventually became the Shiloh campaign. But Smith was very cool about the whole thing, and he basically tried to set Grant's mind at ease and said, "Listen, you're my commander now, and I'm going to serve you. Don't let it be uncomfortable. It doesn't have to be an uncomfortable thing." But it was always very weird for Grant to give orders to a man that he respected as much as C.F. Smith. But Smith definitely the best in the class of 1825. Graduated 19th in that class, so right in the middle of the class. Eduardo Grant never commanded a corps. He commanded a department. He commanded a regiment, and then went to a department command, and then army, and then general of all the armies. All right, so here we go, 1826. Pretty interesting class here. Honestly, there's four real, comparatively speaking, nobodies, and then there's Albert Sidney Johnston. So this one's a pretty easy one here. Albert Sidney Johnston is a class of 1826. 10 years later, in 1836, he's serving as a general in the Army of Texas, in the Texas Revolution and the aftermath of that time. So interesting guy, and again another one of those big what ifs from the Civil War, because he was the highest ranking officer on either side to be killed during the Civil War. Only 4-star general killed during the Civil War. Killed probably by friendly fire at the Battle of Shiloh, shot in the knee, severed an artery. He had been in a duel in his role as an army commander in Texas, or as a general in Texas, and that duel had actually caused some nerve damage that may have caused him to not realize how badly he had been wounded at Shiloh until it was too late. I don't know if that was the same Heintzelman, or was that Samuel Heintzelman? Yeah, Samuel P. Heintzelman, solid general. I shouldn't have said he's a nobody, just comparatively speaking, I guess. So. I'm just catching up on chat here. Yeah, Ryan's definitely somebody who knows a lot of stuff. Ryan was with us in Vicksburg. I got another video coming soon from Vicksburg, and he's the one who loaned me his fantastic reenactment gear to make some of the videos you guys will be seeing down the road. Buford is Napoleon Bonaparte Buford is John Buford's brother. That's his older brother. He's not a Napoleon cousin. He's just named after Napoleon because the parents thought highly of Napoleon Bonaparte. But he is the older brother of John Buford, who was famous because of his service at Gettysburg. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the class of 1827. This is going to be painful to me, who I'm going to end up choosing here. So Napoleon Bonaparte Buford, I think he was a brigadier general, didn't do a whole lot, even though he's the highest ranking one in this class. Hey, Dustin, how's it going? Guys, please keep the chat and the questions to the topic at hand. Yes, Philip St. George Cook is the father-in-law of Jeb Stewart, future father-in-law of Jeb Stewart. Gabriel Rains, not a real significant role in the Civil War. I hate to say it, but it's going to have to be Leonidas Polk in this class. Slim pickings in this class, because I'm not a huge fan of Leonidas Polk as a commander. Polk was a bishop, an Episcopal bishop. They called him the Fighting Bishop. And he was, how he died is a fascinating story, because General Sherman actually saw Polk and a few, just saw some Confederate staff officers off in the distance on a battlefield and ordered artillery fire on the position. And one of the first shots, it may have been the first shot, maybe Ryan can answer that because he's more familiar with the West than I am. Like the first shot basically split Leonidas Polk in half. I mean, it didn't literally split him in half, but for all intents and purposes, that's what it did. And he died soon after. Who was first in the class of 29? That's a great question. I really don't know the answer to. But it wasn't anybody prominent. So Leonidas Polk's got to be, for me, class of 27. All right, class of 28 is an interesting one. Hugh Mercer. Let's talk about him because this brings up a really fascinating West Point story. So Hugh Mercer is the grandson of Hugh Mercer, the Revolutionary War general, who was a good friend of George Washington, who died at the Battle of Princeton. He's also a relative of George S. Patton, who's descended from General Hugh Mercer, not this one, but the other one, his grandfather. But the shot that killed Polk was the worst for the Union cause. Tasmanian Walrus, can't disagree with that. And, it's funny, that brings up a story for me that I'm reminded of when Grant met with Simon Buckner, who we'll see on this list here in a little bit, who was third in command at Fort Donelson, but the first two guys had fled. And Buckner said that General Pillow said that he was too important to the Confederate cause. That's why he had to escape and not surrender. And Grant said, no, I think Pillow being a Confederate general is better for the Union anyway. So Hugh Mercer was actually originally thrown out of West Point. He was part of something called the Eggnog Riots, which is a really interesting story. And Matt, yeah, it is pretty insane, 200,000 just about. Jose, I did talk about one of my ancestors already. But let's talk about the Eggnog Riots for a second here, because this is a really fascinating story that very nearly cost the career of none other than Jefferson Davis. Grant did go to West Point, Nathan. So the Eggnog Riots, basically what happens is a bunch of West Point cadets get drunk on eggnog over the course of a couple of days. So it's sometimes known as the Grog Mutiny. It was a riot that took place at the U.S. Military Academy on the 24th and 25th of December, caused by a drunken Christmas Day party in the North Barracks of the Academy. 2 days prior to the incident, a large quantity of whiskey was smuggled into the Academy to make eggnog for the party, giving the riot its name. 70 cadets were implicated. 20 of them were court-martialed. One of the people who was implicated but not court-martialed was Jefferson Davis. And one of the people who testified was Cadet Robert E. Lee. So here's the list of the guys that ended up being expelled. And you've never heard of most of them because most of them never went on to have a military career. Hugh Mercer was originally guilty, but his guilty designation was overturned and he was allowed to graduate. There was at least one other person who was expelled that went on to have a career. It was Benjamin Humphreys, who went on to be a Confederate Army general, was governor of Mississippi. Jefferson Davis was not charged in the case. John Archibald Campbell became a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. He was one of the people that was found guilty. Another Confederate Army general, of course, Hugh Mercer. A couple of them were allowed. Jefferson Davis, though, very famously not thrown out. So just by default, it's got to be Hugh Mercer because there's really not much competition in the class of 28. Max, there are some really solid generals that didn't go to West Point. Maybe at some point we'll do a ranking list of the non-West Point generals as well. Nathan, yeah, I'm glad you like the list so far. Ryan, Humphreys County, interesting. All right, so here's the class of 29. Much more important class. We've got 3 very prominent Confederate generals in this class. Obviously, Robert E. Lee, who ranked second. James Barnes, who was a Union commander. He was actually the division commander of the division that included the 20th Maine at the Battle of Gettysburg. So you have Barnes there, graduating 5th. We can take Buckingham out of here. Joseph E. Johnston, ranked 13th in the same class that Robert E. Lee was in. Johnston, to me, is one of those really interesting what-ifs, too. If it hadn't been for the fact that Jefferson Davis just obviously did not like Joe Johnston, who knows what would have happened. Because I think Johnston was a much more solid commander than people give him credit for, but he just kept getting removed, and then when the Confederates needed somebody, he would get thrown back in there, and so he never really was given much of a chance. And then the other prominent commander we have here is Theophilus Holmes, who was a Confederate general who commanded in the Trans-Mississippi Theater. But I think it's pretty obvious who we have to go with in the class of 29. It's got to be Robert E. Lee. That's true. Johnston never won any of the major battles he commanded in, but boy, Grant thought very highly of Johnston, and so did Sherman. I mean, yeah, he didn't win any strategic victories, I guess is a good way to say that. All right, class of 1930. Again, not a lot to choose from here. We've got John B. Magruder, who's a prominent Confederate commander. William Nelson Pendleton is kind of an interesting guy. Let's talk about him for a second. So Parson Pendleton, he was known as. Lee was as high as just about anybody who served in the war. There weren't too many first in their class. Macpherson was first in his class. I can't remember if McClellan was first or second in his class. But we'll see a couple of those. Camp Pendleton in Virginia Beach is named after William Nelson Pendleton. So he's a brigadier general in the Confederate Army. One of those generals that's buried in Lexington, Virginia, like Lee, like Stonewall Jackson. But did not do a whole lot during the war. Nothing real substantial. But a pretty solid artillery commander. It's between him, honestly, and Magruder. I don't know. What do you guys think? I kind of lean Pendleton here. I mean, yeah, some of these classes are slim pickings, and then you're going to get to some of these classes where there's going to be several really solid choices. Josh, you were born and raised near Grant's birthplace. He was born in, was it Point Pleasant, Ohio? I know he grew up in Georgetown, but I think he was born in Point Pleasant, down near Cincinnati. So Nathan says Pendleton. Josh says Magruder. Snapping Turtle McGee. Yes, I do think he was a solid general. I do think Magruder's underrated. Magruder was the one that was kind of in command early in the war of the defenses of Richmond, kind of slowing McClellan down, kind of up the... Steve, these rankings, the numbers are where they finished in their West Point class. And then I'm just choosing who I think's the best in each class. This is going to be a tough one because it feels like people are kind of going both ways. But I'm going to go with Pendleton. All right, class of 1831. Andrew A. Humphreys jumps out at me right away on this list. Samuel R. Curtis was another one. Honestly, I feel like it really kind of comes down to these three. I'm kind of leaning Humphreys. Humphreys was, he ended up a corps commander, I believe, in the Army of the Potomac late in the war. He had mostly a division commander is what he's known of. But let's talk about Curtis for a second. One of the first Republicans elected to Congress from Iowa's 1st District. So he was in the Mexican War. So he fights out west in Missouri. His son was killed by Quantrill's raiders, which I did not know that. So that's interesting. And then he fights, kind of in the post-war Indian Wars. But yeah, Curtis is one of those kind of Trans-Mississippi ones you don't hear a lot about. But he was the one who won the Battle of Pea Ridge. So yeah, you know what? Honestly, I think we will go with Curtis. Underrated. Pea Ridge, 3 Confederate generals killed at the Battle of Pea Ridge. But Humphreys was a solid division commander. Not quite as great as a corps commander, I don't think. All right. So, class of 1832. We've got Erasmus Keyes. We've got George Crittenden. It's probably Keyes. I don't know. Maybe Philip St. George Cock in this one. Let's talk about him. It's always confusing because there's a Philip St. George Cook and a Philip St. George Cock. One was a Confederate general, one was a Union general. But this is the Confederate general we're talking about now. So he helps organize the defenses around Richmond. He only fought at First Bull Run. That was like kind of his only battle. Erasmus Keyes, prominent Union commander. Van Dorn was killed by a jealous lover. I think in 1863, early 1863. Not a jealous lover, the husband of the woman who he was having an affair with, I should say. But yeah, isn't it interesting we have a Philip St. George Cock and a Philip St. George Cook? I feel like it's probably got to be Keyes here. None of these guys are real good choices. All right, so we're on to the class of 33. We've got Rufus King, who wasn't he was from Wisconsin. No, that's Rufus Dawes I'm thinking of. Rufus King. Daniel Ruggles is the guy who, he's a Confederate officer. He's known for Ruggles Battery at the Battle of Shiloh, which at the time was the largest artillery barrage at any point in the North American continent. This is a tough one. I'm trying to remember what I remember about Rufus King. He was a senator. Wasn't he a no, he ran. Oh, different guy. That's why. I'm confusing that Rufus King with another one. So that guy is not anybody special. So honestly, just by process of elimination, because none of these guys did anything too great, I got to go with Daniel Ruggles on this one. He was a division commander in the Army of Tennessee. Yeah, that's a different Rufus King that was vice president, I think. That's what I was trying to think of. Yeah, he was vice president under Franklin Pierce. But not the one, but he's not the one who graduated from West Point. Different guy. That's William R. King. All right. All right. Again, not a lot of choices here in the class of 34. Gabriel Paul was a brigade commander at Gettysburg, shot through both eyes on the first day of the battle, commanded one of the brigades in the 1st Corps. Sam Houston did not go to West Point, to my knowledge. I don't think he did. Josh Davis, that's what I was starting to think of. I started to say that Rufus King was the Iron Brigade. And then I kind of took it back because I was thinking I was getting him confused with Rufus Dawes. But yeah, I think you may be right about the Iron Brigade. That was initially what I was starting to think. Here we go. This is our Rufus King. So, yeah, he commanded the... He was also from Wisconsin. Okay. Rufus was just a popular name in Wisconsin. Still going to go with Ruggles, though. But Good Brian honestly didn't do a whole lot. I can't type today. Here he is here. He was a brigadier general in the Confederate Army. He was in a lot of the battles. And I think he was in Longstreet's Corps. Yeah, because he's at Second Bull Run, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and then he goes out to Chickamauga and fights with them. But, you know what, I guess, honestly, just because he was more involved, again, not much to choose from here. I guess I've got to go with Good Brian just because he obviously affected the war more because he commanded a lot more fights than Gabriel Paul did. All right, here we go. The class of 1835, 56 in this class. We've got some good generals in this one. We're gonna take a few of them out, just because I want to talk about a few of them. Though I think there's a pretty obvious choice here. There's a few guys I want to actually talk about. So let's come down to these three here, all on the Union side. Herman Haupt is kind of the train guy during the American Civil War. He is the one who, he had been prominent. A lot of these guys were involved in railroad companies, but Herman Haupt really knew his stuff when it came to trains. And he's one of the main reasons why the Union was able to take such good advantage of using their rail network to move supplies, to move troops, things like that. So Herman Haupt is a solid choice, and he probably would do well in many of these other classes. Marcina Patrick, again, he's the provost marshal of the Army of the Potomac. He's the guy who very famously rides into Fredericksburg when the Union Army is looting the town, and gets all ticked off and says, "This is an army, not a rabble," and he's like trying to whip people and keep them from doing things they shouldn't do. But the obvious choice here is George Meade, who I think is one of the most underrated generals of the Civil War. Meade was a really good commander who gets overshadowed because of so much of his army command is when Grant is right there with him. But Meade was a really good general. He was a good division commander. Wasn't a corps commander very long because he went pretty rapidly from division to corps command to command of the Army of the Potomac. Dude took command of the Army of the Potomac like 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg. He hadn't even had a chance to get his feet wet, and he has to fight one of the most important battles in American history and wins it. Not enough good has been said about George B. Meade, but also, as a lower ranking officer, as a division commander, he was really pretty much the only Union general who had significant success at the Battle of Fredericksburg. He broke through Stonewall Jackson's line at Fredericksburg, but because his higher ups were so incompetent, they didn't follow up that attack and exploit it. But one of the things I really want to do is I want to visit the cemetery. I think it's Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, where he's buried. Incidentally, you know who else is buried in the same cemetery as Meade is John C. Pemberton, who was the Confederate general who defended Vicksburg. And Meade's family, including his widow, were very unhappy when they found out that Pemberton was going to be buried in the same cemetery as Meade. Meade was solid. Meade was a good general. Easy choice in the class of 1835. All right, class of 1836. So we've got Montgomery Meigs, who is responsible for Arlington National Cemetery. He's the one who chose that site to start burying soldiers in Robert E. Lee's yard so that he could never come back and use it again. Not a lot of other great choices here. We got Lloyd Tillman. So Lloyd Tillman is responsible for Forts Henry and Donelson. He's the one who oversaw construction of those forts, which is not necessarily a good thing because Fort Henry in particular was very poorly laid out and designed. And it was so bad that it was so easily taken that by the time Grant showed up with his army, it had already surrendered to the Navy. Tillman was killed in the Vicksburg campaign. You'll see me talk about him in that upcoming video. Henry Lockwood is a general in the Army of the Potomac. I want to say 12th Corps. But to me, as far as impact on the war itself, Tillman disemboweled by a solid shot that had already gone through and killed his horse. Tillman lived longer than the horse did. And his son, who was on his staff, was brought to him soon after, but I think he'd already died by the time his son got there. But Montgomery Meigs, his son died in 1864, and he had him buried in Mrs. Lee's rose garden. So just because he's responsible for Arlington National Cemetery is probably enough to put him number one in that class. George Washington, I appreciate that. Amari, who's the best general in the Civil War? You know, it honestly depends on what you're talking about, but overall, from start to finish, I've got to go with Grant. I really do. Lockwood was on Culp's Hill. You're right, Nathan. All right, class of 37. We got a bunch of folks here. This is an interesting class. Look at the names on this list. So, we'll take out Benham, who was number one. We're gonna leave some of the kind of more interesting names on this list. So we've got Jubal Early, who. So interesting thing. Another fascinating story about this. Jubal Early. There was a fight at one point in the cafeteria at West Point, and another cadet. Let's see how fast anybody gets this. Some of you may already know this. Was expelled from West Point for breaking a cafeteria tray over Jubal Early's head, but went on to be a Confederate general anyway. Let's see how quickly somebody gets that one. William Henry French. John Sedgwick. We got John C. Pemberton, Joseph Hooker, Arnold Elzey is in this. No, Sheridan's much younger. Pemberton and Bragg, I get douche chills all over my southern body. It was Armistead, Lego. Very good. Louis Armistead broke a tray over Jubal Early's head and was expelled from West Point because of that fight. All right, so just look at this part of the list. French, prominent Union commander. John Sedgwick, pretty solid. All right, we're going to take Braxton Bragg out of there because, it's Braxton Bragg. Same with John C. Pemberton. Horrible excuse for a general. Imagine if Jefferson Davis liked Joe Johnston a tenth as much as he liked John C. Pemberton. I don't know. For me, all right, we'll take French out. Honestly, I'm not a huge Jubal Early fan. Sedgwick is really solid. I can't think of any big negatives against Sedgwick. Sedgwick, incidentally, the highest ranking Union officer killed during the Civil War. Yes, he was only a Corps commander and James Macpherson was an Army commander, but Sedgwick outranked Macpherson by how early his commission was. Hooker was a good Corps commander. Hooker was actually a good Army commander later in the war under Sherman. So this one's going to be interesting because you know what? I'm taking Early out. To me, it comes down to these two. Convince me why I should go with one or the other, because I'm torn on this one. Hooker failed at Chancellorsville, but man, I'm not as hard on Hooker over Chancellorsville as a lot of people are. I think Hooker should have been temporarily relieved of command. Dude was shell-shocked at Chancellorsville. And Hooker did some really good things later in the war. Hooker Hooker's buried in Ohio. He's buried down in Cincinnati. There's like 40 Union generals buried in one cemetery in Cincinnati, and he's one of them. I got to go with Hooker. I do. I like Uncle John Sedgwick. I got to go with Hooker. I think Hooker was a good general. He had a really bad time at Chancellorsville. But otherwise, yeah, Spring Grove. That's right, Josh Davis. Don't pick anyone from Ohio. Hooker's not from Ohio. He's just buried there. Ryan Burns says should have been early. I know a lot of our Southern friends especially are going to pick early, and I wouldn't argue a whole lot against that choice. But all right, here we go. Class of 38. We got Beauregard. We got Irvin McDowell. Isn't that interesting that the two guys who go head-to-head at the first Battle of Bull Run, Manassas for my Southern friends, are in the same class of 38. So we can take these three out right away here. We've got Hardy. We'll take them out. Henry Sibley. Edward Johnson. Carter Stevenson. So Carter Stevenson, solid Confederate general. Part of the army that surrenders at Vicksburg. We've got Edward Johnson. I think he was a division commander in the Confederate Army. Sibley is a Confederate general. Irvin McDowell. P.G.T. Beauregard. I think Beauregard's a decent general. He's prominent in a lot of these battles. I think he's probably better than a lot of people give him credit for. I'm going to go with Beauregard here. I like Beauregard. Had a little bit of a French accent going on there. Kind of a Louisiana Creole. I don't blame Beauregard for Shiloh because I think most of the damage had been done by the time he took command of that army. Fired on Fort Sumter. He was in command of those troops. But Beauregard's one of that initial crop of... it's interesting, and at some point we'll probably examine this. Most of the Confederates who had 4-star rank in the Confederate Army were given that rank like right at the beginning of the war. They really didn't add too many new ones as the war went on, and Beauregard was one of that initial crop of 4-star generals. All right, here we go. Let's look at the class of 39. This is an interesting class here. You got Isaac Stevens, who was a Union general. Henry Halleck, who is general-in-chief. They called him Old Brains for a good bit of the war. Ricketts is interesting. Edward Ord was very much trusted by Grant. Was a corps commander under Grant. He was actually given command of... what's his name's corps during the Vicksburg campaign. Oh, I'm drawing a blank on the idiot that he couldn't stand. McClernand. We got Henry Hunt, who was the chief of artillery in the Army of the Potomac. E.R.S. Canby is in this one. There's a lot of really good choices here. I'm going to narrow this one down a little bit here. Definitely to these 4. Halleck was a good desk general. Had no business in field command. And while early on probably did everything he could to screw Grant's career, later on actually I think really was a supporter of Grant. And was left in that chief of staff position even after Grant became the head of the Union Army. So Grant thought highly. Grant repeatedly in his memoirs speaks very highly of Halleck. More so than I think he probably should have. I'm kind of leaning toward Ord here. Canby was, one of those West generals. And Henry Hunt, I mean, he's an artillery commander, but probably didn't have a lot of overall influence on the war itself. Isaac Stevens, we can go ahead and take him out. To me, it comes down to Edward O.C. Ord or Henry Halleck. Halleck married to Alexander Hamilton's granddaughter. One of my little fun facts I always like to throw out. I'm sure you've heard me say it before. But Grant liked and trusted both of these guys. Ryan, you make a good point that as the Army of the Potomac artillery chief, Hunt, but I don't know. I don't know how much that's on him. This is tough for me. I think Halleck probably has a greater impact on the war itself. So I'm going to go with Halleck, though I'm not really crazy about Halleck. Oh, look at this class. All right, we can take Hebert out right away, huh? We've got George Henry Thomas. We've got William Tecumseh Sherman. We've got Richard Ewell. We've got Bushrod Johnson, who's the Ohio Confederate. So obviously it comes down to these three are the most prominent in this class. So let's talk about the class of 1840 a little bit. Any one of these guys would probably have won a lot of the other classes, but you're going to start to see this now that we get into the classes of the 40s. You're going to see a lot of like really good choices in some of these. I feel like you have to go with Sherman here, right? I mean, Thomas was solid. And Ewell was a good division commander, but he was never the same after he lost a leg at Groveton, and then especially after he becomes a corps commander, he was never a good corps commander. Thomas, solid general, very solid general, not what I would say an outstanding general, but solid. A reliable general, one of the better generals in the Union Army, certainly deserves a lot of credit for standing when a lot of other people ran at Chickamauga. It's got to be Sherman, though. I mean, you can't possibly go with anybody else but Sherman in this one. All right, we're on to the class of 41. We've got Zealous Tower, Horatio Wright, who is a corps commander in the Union Army. Albion Howe, Nathaniel Lyon, killed early in the war, not a good general, I don't think. Schuyler Hamilton, who was a grandson of Alexander Hamilton. We've got John F. Reynolds. There's more here. Let me narrow this one down because this is a big class with some really solid generals in it. We're gonna take some of these guys out just to talk about some of the more prominent ones here. Not that I'm necessarily going to choose some of these, but just because I want to show you who all's in this class. It's a stacked class. Robert and Richard Garnett were both killed on the Confederate side. You got Don Carlos Buell in this class. Israel Richardson's in this class. John M. Jones is in this class. Abraham Buford, who's a Confederate general, who is a cousin of John Buford. Look at that class. This is a huge... And you're going to see this a lot in the 40s and 50s. Lyon threw a rock at a Confederate after being surrounded, and the rebel pulled out a pistol and shot him. Nathaniel Lyon was not a good general. He just wasn't at all. Killed early in the war. Most of these guys I wouldn't choose. Richard Garnett, killed in Pickett's charge, disappeared during the Battle of Pickett's charge, probably wounded in such a way as to not be identifiable, either by uniform or by physical. Robert Garnett, I think, was killed really early in the war. He may have been the first Confederate general to die in the Civil War. Israel Richardson, killed at Antietam. Don Carlos Buell, of course, is an Army commander in the Union Army. J.M. Jones, Confederate general. I feel like it's got to come down to Reynolds in this class, doesn't it? I mean, I don't see anybody here that's better than Reynolds. It's got to be John Reynolds. Pennsylvania represent. Class of 42. Look at this class. Oh, man. Here we go. We've got Henry Eustis, who was a Union general. First in the class, but not going to be on this list. We got William Rosecrans, Gustavus Smith, Alexander P. Stewart. Martin Luther Smith, I think, was a Confederate general. We got John Pope in this class. We've got Abner Doubleday, D.H. Hill, Napoleon Dana, George Sykes, Richard Anderson, Lafayette McLaws, Earl Van Dorn, and James Longstreet. That is a heck of a class. My goodness. So let's narrow this one down just a little bit. John Newton, Corps Commander in the Army of the Potomac. Rosecrans, Army Commander out west. Almost was Lincoln's running mate in 1864. Not a great general, though. I mean, I shouldn't say not a great general. Had some really solid moments as an army commander, but failed miserably in places like Chickamauga. That is baseball Doubleday, though Doubleday did not invent baseball. So let's narrow down some of this. John Pope's not going to be the choice, but I'm at least going to kind of narrow down this list a little bit so we can see a little bit more of it. Earl Van Dorn. I mean, these are a lot of guys that rose to high command. You got a corps commander, an army commander, a corps commander. D.H. Hill, I think, commanded a corps, or at least a division. He got like a 3-star rank, though. George Sykes was a corps commander. Richard Anderson was a corps commander. Lafayette McLaws is the division commander. Longstreet, a corps commander. I mean, dang. This is a solid class. I like Newton, but I can't go with him. It's got to be Longstreet, right? I mean, I don't know how I choose anybody in this list over James Longstreet. Kenny Horton, sorry to be streaming when you're not home. Yes, Van Dorn was shot by a guy who, with whom he was having... Van Dorn was having an affair with a woman, and the husband shot him. Okay. William Buell Franklin. So the class of 43 is an interesting one. And there's an obvious choice in this one, but we'll narrow it down a little bit first. Franklin's first in that class. And as we work our way down, we got Joseph Reynolds, who was a general. Samuel French. Christopher Columbus Augur was a general. We've got Ulysses S. Grant in this class. Rufus Ingalls. Fred Dent, who's Grant's future brother-in-law. But to me, I mean, this one's kind of obvious. Grant was actually a really good student, and his goal upon graduating from West Point was he wanted to be a math professor. He actually hoped he could maybe even go back to West Point as a math professor at West Point. Just put Grant, everybody says. Yeah, it's Grant. It's definitely Grant, the class of 43. And him and Longstreet were very close friends. Longstreet was a cousin of the Dent family. And he was at Grant's wedding to Julia Dent. Some people say he was the best man, but whether that's the case or not there's conflicting evidence about that. But he was definitely at the wedding in Missouri, and actually was present when Grant met his wife for the first time. All right, class of 44, not as much to choose from, but I feel like there's a couple of easy choices here. Pleasanton, not a great general. There's a reason he did not command the Army of the Potomac's cavalry for very long. And in hindsight, General Meade acknowledged that it should have been Buford who commanded the cavalry and not Pleasanton. But you got Simon Buckner, who famously surrenders Fort Donelson to Grant, and Alexander Hayes, who actually served under Hancock. But yeah, I mean, this has got to be Hancock. Hancock the Superb is... who are the Dent family? So the Dent family, Amari, are Grant's in-laws. His wife, her maiden name was Julia Dent. Her father, he was known as Colonel Dent, was a Missouri slave owner who did not like his son-in-law very much and was very much opposed to that match. Thought that Julia marrying Ulysses was beneath her, and yet he ends up becoming president of the United States. Grant as math professor. A brigade leaves Vicksburg at 3 o'clock. Another brigade leaves Ohio at 5 o'clock. So Tim, what happened there was Grant runs into Buckner in New York when he's in financially a very difficult situation, and Buckner paid off some debts for Grant. And so they were friends. They were on good terms, but that didn't keep Grant from demanding unconditional surrender from him at Fort Donelson. Okay, we are on to the class of 45. Not as much to choose from here, considering how stacked some of these other classes were. So we can narrow this one down a little bit. We got Fitzjohn Porter, who was a prominent Union commander. We've got Edmund Kirby Smith. Bernard B., who's the one who gave Stonewall Jackson his nickname. Gordon Granger's there. I feel like it's probably got to be Edmund Kirby Smith. The thing with Grant and alcoholism, I'm not entirely sure that I would, and I'm not an expert on this topic, I'm not entirely sure that I would consider Grant an alcoholic so much as he was a binge drinker. Because Grant could control his alcoholism. He could go months without touching the stuff. But then he would just go on this like ridiculous bender for a couple of days. And he couldn't hold his liquor either. I think it was, and I don't know the difference, but I think there is a difference. I don't know if he was strictly an alcoholic. Class of 45 means you're young during a war, but you'll see some pretty prominent classes yet to come. I feel like it's got to be Edmund Kirby Smith. Fitzjohn Porter ends up kind of getting disgraced midway through the war. Here we go, 46. Look at this class. We've got George B. McClellan graduating second. He was young, too. He was like 20 when he graduated from West Point. He had graduated from college at like 16, and then he goes to West Point. Brilliant guy. Just couldn't apply that knowledge real good as an effective field commander. Jesse Reno, who was killed during the war. We got Darius Couch. Thomas Jonathan Jackson, 17th in that class. We've got George Stoneman, who's a prominent Union commander. Dabney Maury, who was a Confederate commander and a distant cousin of mine. Cadmus Marcellus Wilcox. George E. Pickett. So let's narrow this one down a little bit. Look at these three that are in this class right here. Easy choice for me, honestly. But kind of the top of the class, you got George B. McClellan. Jackson's kind of midway through the top of the class. And then down at the bottom, you got George Pickett. But to me, though I don't think as highly as Jackson as a lot of people do, it's Jackson. He was a great organizing officer. I agree. I think McClellan would have been great in a role like Eisenhower had, or like George C. Marshall, like a chief of staff in Washington kind of thing. Yeah, that's what somebody just said. Good in a George Marshall type role. All right, class of 47. Orlando Wilcox, Union commander. A.P. Hill is in this class. We've got Ambrose Burnside, 18th in his class. John Gibbon. Romaine Ayres is a Union general. Charles Griffin. Thomas Neal. Henry Heath is in this class. So there's some solid choices in this one. I like John Gibbon a lot. I like Burnside. I think Burnside is another one of those guys who, because he performed badly at Fredericksburg, people don't realize that he had a lot of other really solid moments as a general. I'm kind of leaning Burnside here. A.P. Hill, again, not a bad... He was a great division commander. Excellent division commander. Never really good in the role of Corps Command. Heath is a solid division commander, too. Burnside suffered from some confidence issues. Yeah, the crater is rough for Burnside, and there's a reason we don't see him much after that. Rishikesh, did you do wrong? I'm not sure I really understand what you mean by that. I like Gibbon a lot, too. He's a Southern guy who fights for the North, while some of his brothers fought for the Confederacy. All right, I'm going to narrow this one down a little bit. I like Heath, but I don't know. All the crater was definitely real. All right. I'm torn between A.P. Hill and Burnside, but I'm going to go A.P. Hill. Gibbon's solid. I like Gibbon a lot. But Gibbon didn't really... I'm trying to think of who had the greater impact on the war for his cause in a positive way. I don't know. I could be persuaded to change my opinion on that one. All right. Not a lot in 48, but to me, one really stands out. And it's John Buford. Buford, underrated. And there's a reason I did a Forgotten History episode on Buford. I like Buford a lot. Josh, thank you. Hello. Yeah, I'm a big fan of John Buford, and I'm a huge fan of Sam Elliott as John Buford in the Gettysburg movie. Love that casting choice a lot. Okay, where are we at? Class of 49. We got Quincy Adams Gilmore. Boy, there's not a lot of great choices here, are there? Man. Dang, this class sucks. I don't even know where to start here. Nobody jumps out at me like as an obvious choice. Can we just delete this class? Oh. Will D, I would agree with that. That Sheridan and Buford were the best cavalry commanders on the Union side, for sure. Field, Charles Field, solid choice. Gilmore was like he was a engineer, wasn't he? Yeah, he was an engineer. Oh, Lorain, Ohio. He's a Northeast Ohio guy. I didn't realize that. Fort Pulaski. His modern rifled artillery pounded the fort's walls. I didn't realize he was from Lorain. I thought he was the guy down there at Fort Wagner. Ah, boy. Yeah, I feel like it's got to be Field. I'm going to go with Charles Field. Let's talk about Charles Field for a second. Not the English footballer. There he is. So Charles W. Field, he's from Woodford County, Kentucky. Isn't that where the Bufords are from? I can't remember for sure. He was one of those Confederates that went to fight for the Egyptians afterwards. A bunch of them got offered those roles. So yeah, he's kind of absent for a good bit of the war, but yeah, I got to go with Field. Not a great class though, really. Nothing substantial there. Hey, Amari, I'm glad you could join us for a while. All right, class of 1850. Gouverneur Warren, second in the class. Who else we got here? Eugene Carr. Charles Winder, who was the guy that was in charge of the prison camps for the Confederates. Boy, this seems like, I mean, there's really only one choice here, isn't there? It's got to be Gouverneur Warren. This is the guy who is most responsible for getting Union troops up to Little Round Top at Gettysburg. Sheridan did screw over Warren, so Gouverneur Warren becomes a corps commander. He was the chief of topographical engineers for the Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg. He's the guy whose statue is up on Little Round Top, because he's the one that was up there and saw the Confederates coming in Longstreet's attack and sent a courier to General Sykes of the 5th Corps to get a brigade up on Little Round Top. He becomes a corps commander, 5th Corps he commands eventually. And right in the last week of the war, he's relieved of command on the field by Phil Sheridan. And Grant upholds that, but there was a later inquiry that exonerated Gouverneur Warren. I feel like he did get screwed, I think. Yeah, Gouverneur Warren, solid commander during the war. R. Warren, you will never offend me if you choose Band of Brothers over me, sir. Tobias, thank you. Appreciate that. All right, class of 1851. We've got Benjamin Helm, who is the brother-in-law of Abraham Lincoln. Speaking of brothers-in-law, I don't know if you know this, but D.H. Hill and Stonewall Jackson's wives were sisters. Just kind of a fun little fact. I was going to mention that when we talked about D.H. Hill, and I forgot. Helm kind of jumps out at me in this group. He was killed at Chickamauga, I think. Junius Daniel was a Confederate general. Yeah, Ryan just mentioned that. Helm was killed at Chickamauga. I feel like Helm's probably the choice that stands out to me the most in this class. I don't know. Junius Daniel was not that great. Yeah, he was leading the Orphan Brigade. That's right. Yeah, I want to go to Johnston's Island at some point. Helm, to me, Orphan Brigade's a solid Confederate unit. Kentucky boys. Interesting class here. We got Henry Slocum, who you don't realize looking at pictures of Henry Slocum that he's as young as he was. He looks older. I think he prematurely grayed or something. But he looks older than he really was during the Civil War in the pictures. So who else do we have in this class that really is going to be up there with Slocum? Alexander McCook, another Northeastern Ohio guy. He was a corps commander. George Crook. Who else is in it? I guess that's about it. I feel like it's got to be Slocum here. Yeah, war does age people. You're right. But let me show you a picture of Henry Slocum for a second. You'll see what I mean. I mean, does this look like a guy who was only 35 years old? He does not look like a guy in his mid-30s to me. I don't know why. I think it's probably just the gray hair. It's got to be. I just always pictured him as like mid to late 40s. But he was 35 at the Battle of Gettysburg. Or 36 maybe. That's what I thought too, mid-40s. But I think Slocum, solid corps commander. I think he may have even commanded an army late in the war out west. I'm trying to remember if he did. I know he went out west. He was a corps commander out west. In the March to the Sea, Carolina's campaigns. He was the Army of Georgia, so he was an army commander. I thought so. Hawkins commanded U.S. colored troops. Yeah, I don't see anybody that to me is better than Slocum in terms of the impact on the war. Army commander, solid in that role. All right, here we go. Class of 53, James Macpherson. By the way, I believe he pronounced his middle name Birdsey, not Birdseye like it looks like. I think he pronounced it Birdsey. James Birdsey Macpherson. One of my favorite generals. Of course, I had an ancestor who was in his corps and in his army during the war. As an army commander, would have been president of the United States if he hadn't been killed at Atlanta. I don't see anybody else. John Schofield's a solid commander. I feel like it's probably... Well, oh, wait. Oh, we got more in this class. Hold on. Ooh, this is a good class. Let's narrow this down a little more, shall we? We got Phil Sheridan, 34th in that class. We got John Bell Hood, 44th in that class. So we got four really prominent generals here. Don't you dare say... I will not, Ryan, don't worry. I just left him up there because everybody knows who he is, and these are four very prominent commanders. Hood, great division commander, not a good army commander at all. And listen, I got a lot of sympathy for Hood. And here's another guy who was younger than people realize. He was like in his 20s when the war started. Hood lost, basically, for all intents and purposes, lost an arm at Gettysburg. He lost use of it. It just didn't actually get amputated. Lost a leg a couple months later at Chickamauga. I mean, 1863 was a brutal year for John Bell Hood. And then after all of that, he's put in command of an army. during the battle for Atlanta. But we'll take Schofield out and we'll take Hood out. It's probably going to be Sheridan here. I'm not as high on Sheridan as a lot of people are, but Sheridan, I think, is probably, of all the generals in the Union Army, I think Sheridan is the most like Grant. Grant was like this bulldog who was determined, and when he decided he was going to do something, he was going to get it done. He was a fighter. You know, the way that Lincoln said, "I can't spare this man, he fights." Sheridan was like that too. And I've got a lot of issues with Sheridan post-war, but I don't want to judge Sheridan's Civil War record on what I consider to be kind of a lousy human being and how he dealt with the Indians' wars afterwards. So as much as I really, really like McPherson, I feel like I probably have to go with Sheridan. Another Ohio guy. They're both Ohio guys. McPherson's an Ohio guy too. Rich Kesh, I appreciate the problems you're going through, but I'm not really sure how we can help you during a stream about the Civil War. I'm sorry. All right. So we got George Washington Custis Lee, who outdid his father and finished first in his class. His dad was second in his class. Thomas Ruger was a Union general. Oliver Howard, solid general. John Pegram is in this class. You know, you don't really think about John Pegram and Oliver Howard being the same age. I always think of Howard as being older and Pegram being this young guy, but they were in the same class. Jeb Stewart is in this class. Look at the top of this class, what you've got here. Archibald Gracie, Stephen Dill Lee, another Confederate general who was pretty solid. Dorsey Pender is in this class. Stephen Weed, who was killed on Little Round Top at Gettysburg. A lot of generals, Lego, were from Ohio. A lot of really solid generals from Ohio. Pegram is killed during the war. Stewart was killed during the war. Dorsey Pender died in the war. Stephen Weed died in the war. Excellent point, Ryan, about the number of men from the class of 54 who died. And, you know, part of that's probably because they were younger, and so they're probably more prone to take risks. They hadn't been in combat before, at least not in a war like the guys who had fought in Mexico, so those guys were probably a little more cautious. Was Gracie, was that Archibald Gracie that was on the Titanic, Ryan? I didn't realize that. His son. There's always another Lee. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to narrow this one down a little bit. Custis Lee's a good general, but I don't think it's going to be him. Pegram, again, solid leader, but not a top guy on this list. Stephen Dill Lee was decent. Excuse me. I'm going to sneeze here. Stephen Weed, brigade commander, but again, nothing spectacular. Godfrey Weissel's in this class. Oh, we still got more in this class here. Look at this. Actually, I think I went to the next class by accident. Hold on. All right. I guess it's got to be Jeb Stewart, right? I mean, Oliver Howard, I think, was a better general than people give him credit for. Will, I agree. Jeb Stewart, I don't think, was as great as people remember him being, but still probably the best on that class list. Class of 1855, Godfrey Weitzel. David M. Gregg is a Union cavalry commander. Alexander Webb, who's a Union general. Alfred T.A. Torbert was a Union general. Nobody really great here. I'm going to narrow this one down a little bit, though I think it probably is going to be Gregg for me in this one. I think Howard's one of those guys, speaking of that previous class, another one of those generals who all anybody wants to talk about is their screw-ups, and people don't really focus on success they had later. Howard did some really good things later in the war after that really bad spring and summer he had in 1863 at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. Grant was in the class of 43, back here. All right, so I think it's got to be David M. Gregg for this one for me. No, Fitzhugh Lee's not bad at all. I just don't think he was the best in that class. All right, class of 56. So now we're getting to the place where we're talking like 5 years before the Civil War here. So you're not going to see quite the prominent names that you saw in the 40s. We've got Fitz Lee, who's Robert E. Lee's nephew. Samuel Carroll, who was a Union general. I don't see anybody else on this list. Orlando Poe. So I think it probably comes down to these two. I think was it Fitzhugh Lee that took command of the Confederate cavalry in the East after Jeb Stewart was killed? I think it was Fitz Lee. It was either him or George Walker. Yeah, I think it was Fitz Lee. Fitzhugh Lee's buried like right by Jefferson Davis in Richmond in the same cemetery. He was I think, governor of Virginia after the war. His dad was Robert E. Lee's brother and was actually a naval officer in the Confederate Army. I think I'm going to probably have to go to... I'm going to have to go with Fitz Lee in the class of 56. All right, this is an interesting one here. E.P. Alexander, young guy, but solid artillery officer in the Army of the Potomac. George Crockett Strong was the commanding officer in the attack on Fort Wagner, was killed in that attack. He's the one, you see him in the, if you've seen the movie Glory, he's the one who has that conversation with, he's like, it's Shaw, isn't it? Your men haven't slept for 2 days. And he's the one giving them the instructions about what they're going to have to do to attack Fort Wagner. He was killed in that same attack. So I don't really see anybody else on this list. I think it's got to be E.P. Alexander here. Really good artillery officer. Yeah, Fitzhugh Lee led the final offensive action in the Army of Northern Virginia on April 9th that morning. Robert Anderson, yeah. Is that the same Robert Anderson? Robert H. Anderson. So this is him here. This is not the Anderson you're thinking of, who was a corps commander in the Confederate Army. Different Robert Anderson. We saw him earlier. That was Richard Anderson, I should say, not Robert Anderson. So yeah, it's got to be E.P. Alexander here. Zach, what's going on? All right, we don't really have any good choices in the class of 58. And we're not going to get much in these last couple of classes, unfortunately. Yeah, there were a lot of Andersons in the war, you're right. Common name. Honestly, I'm really not that familiar with much of what either one of these guys did. Here's Charles Garrison Harker right here. He was killed at Kennesaw Mountain. Brigadier General. Led a brigade at so he drew attention of senior commanders with a determined stand against Confederate attacks at the Battle of Chickamauga. Commanded a brigade under Oliver Howard and was killed at Kennesaw Mountain. Brian Thomas. Here he is here. Georgia, unconfirmed brigadier general. There were a lot of unconfirmed generals. I feel like this one's got to be Harker. Don't bother looking up Thomas, Ryan said. All right. Class of 59. This one's easy. It's Joe Wheeler. Joe Wheeler is that rare specimen who was a Confederate officer who became a Union general after the war, a U.S. general. Let's talk about Joe Wheeler. Interesting fellow here. I don't want his obituary. I just want him. So here's Fighting Joe Wheeler, who was in the House of Representatives. Incidentally, you know who else was elected to Congress? Joe Johnston served a term as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He's buried in Arlington, a Confederate general buried at Arlington National Cemetery. I'm planning on going to Arlington sometime late September. I want to go to Arlington and the U.S. History Museum, make some videos for you guys. Check out young Joe Wheeler at West Point. Pretty cool view there. But yeah, Joe Wheeler, interesting, cool story. Comes back to serve after the war. In the Spanish-American War, 61 years old, made a Major General Volunteers by William McKinley. Joe Johnston was a boxer. Yeah, Joe Wheeler, definitely. All right, here we go. Interesting one here. Class of 1860. These are guys that were right out of West Point right before the war starts. I think it's got to come down to Stephen Ramseur and Wesley Merritt. So we got one on the Confederate side, one on the Union side. Give me your arguments for one or the other. ACB Nielsen, appreciate that. Ryan's like, Ramseur, pick the Confederate. Ramseur's a general in the Army of Northern Virginia. Wesley Merritt, I believe, was a cavalry officer. We'll talk about him when I go out to Little Bighorn, because he was prominent in the Plains Indians Wars. Yeah, Merritt. I think Wesley Merritt was also. Was he in charge at West Point? I feel like he commanded West Point at one point, or maybe I'm thinking of the GAR. He was in command of the GAR. He was first American military governor of the Philippines. There he is during the Civil War. Young general right there. I mean, he's 25 when the war breaks out. I'm trying to think. Oh, he was superintendent of West Point. That's what it was. All right. I think I'm going to go with Stephen Ramseur here. Class of May 1861. Now, if you're not familiar with this, what happened was because the war breaks out and they have a desperate need for West Point trained officers, they accelerate the classes. And so they graduate the class of 61 in May. The class of 62, they bump up and they graduate them in June of 61. And we've only got one general from the class of June 61, and that's George Armstrong Custer. Stop this nonsense. It's Ramseur. So here, interesting group. Emory Upton, Adelbert Ames, the last Union general officer to die. He died in like 1933 or something. He was the original commanding officer of the 20th Maine. Post-war, I know Ryan will mention this, post-war governor of Mississippi. Since Ryan's from Mississippi. Adelbert Ames eventually commands, I want to say he goes all the way up to division command late in the war. But he got promoted to brigade command right before Gettysburg in the 11th Corps, which is why Chamberlain becomes the new colonel of the 20th Maine. Yes, Custer is from New Rumley, Ohio, which is about an hour away from me. So I'm not a fan of Hugh Judson Kilpatrick. They called him Kill Cavalry. Not a fan of his at all. Emory Upton is an interesting guy. He's the one who comes up with the Union plan to attack the Confederate fortifications at Spotsylvania. And basically what the strategy was to basically have a pinprick attack, but just put a bunch of waves of Union infantry, one right after the other, and attack one spot in the Union lines. And because of that, he was immediately bumped up to brigade command. A guy in charge of Maine troops who went on to govern. Zach, yeah, a lot of that going around in Reconstruction. Only Republican governor of Mississippi until 1996. Yep. Hide user on the channel. There we go. Okay. What the heck is with the webcam chat thing? All right, I deleted it, so we're good. So yeah, to me it comes down to Albert Ames or Emery Upton on this one. I think I'll go with Ames. Interesting story. If you've ever seen the movies Gettysburg and Gods and Generals, the actor who plays Adelbert Ames in Gods and Generals had been one of the privates in the 20th Maine in Gettysburg. You see him in a few of the scenes. Let me see what his name was. I don't remember his name off the top of my head. Somebody will probably come up with it before me, but I'll find it here. He's like Stephen Lang. He's one of those guys who has different roles in the different movies. Let's see. Matt Lester. That's his name. So check this out. Oh, I forgot. He was the bad guy in Mask of Zorro. He's the one that the Union or the American officer in Mask of Zorro. That's right. So let me show you what he looked like in Gettysburg. So the next time you watch that movie, you'll recognize him. Yeah, so here he is in Mask of Zorro. That's what he looked like in Mask of Zorro. But he's in the movie Gettysburg. But I'm trying to find an image of him that I can show you. He had facial hair in both, but it was different. Oh well. Anyway, just you'll find him. You'll see him in the movie Gettysburg. He's definitely in there. I don't know if he has any speaking parts, but he's in it. So that really kind of leaves us with no other choices on the rest of these. So he is one of the deserters, one of the guys from the Second Maine, one of the mutineers that gets added. I am a descendant of John Clifford. That's right. I'm fighting for my rats. No man will call me a coward. That's right. That is, you're right. That is his line. All right. Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate that. Ryan's such a great resource for me on this stuff. I appreciate it. All right. So that's it. I mean, that's really all we have on that one. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you guys so much for joining us. And we'll probably come back and do another stream tomorrow. So if you have any ideas for a stream, head on over to Discord and let me know. We'll wrap this up. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Have a great weekend.